I would like to welcome you to Booth University College Heritage Days 2024. I'm Isaiah Allen, Assistant Professor of Religion at Booth University College. And this week is an annual opportunity for the Booth University College community to emphasize its heritage in the Salvation Army. The angle that we are examining today is how the very idea of a university corresponds to vision and discourse amongst Salvation Army leaders as early as William Booth. So I'm glad that each of you has chosen to join us for this panel discussion and the classically complimentary soup and donuts later on. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement because it is a beginning to acknowledge that Booth University College and this event takes place on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This land is within Treaty 1. We acknowledge this to be a meeting place of community and culture. As in the past, the diversity of peoples who occupy this land and the emerging culture that enrich our community today present to us an invitation to build a stronger community as we learn to walk gently with one another in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. I want to leave as much time as possible for the panel discussion, but I have a few important and timely announcements to share. February is Black History Month. Please pay attention to the beautiful first floor bulletin board and Populi for announcements about that from student council and so forth. I'll remind you that the student versus faculty and staff basketball game on Friday, February 16th at 2 p.m. You will not want to miss it. We will need witnesses, and I'm even planning to play. After today's panel discussion, the bistro will be providing soup and donuts free of charge. Other menu items are at the regular price. So please join us in the bistro for lunch and enjoy the Salvation Army Brass Ensemble, comprised of Heritage Park Temple Corps members and Booth UC students. And please express your gratitude to the musicians and to the bistro staff as you go down. And one more announcement. Next week, President Rob Fringer is going to be speaking at Booth University College Chapel, and so I hope that you'll come out to participate in that. As I introduce each of our panelists, I invite them to step forward, grab a microphone and a stool. Our guests are known by many in this community, so I'm only going to say a word or two about why they've been invited to contribute to this panel. Dr. Aaron Klassen, PhD, Carleton University, is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Booth University College. He's a qualitative researcher as well as a musician and has focused on the juncture of music and social change. When we consider the question of a university as an expression of Salvation Army mission, Dr. Klassen may share his recent and ongoing research in musical and educational self-transformation and a project that brings Booth University College into the future. Shelter you. You're going to find out that emphasis is thematic. So, Dr. Donald Burke, PhD, Toronto School of Theology, is Professor of Biblical Studies at Booth University College. His area of expertise is the Old Testament, and among his many specific areas of interest are Old Testament prophetic literature, theological interpretation of Scripture, and Christianity's orientation toward the marginalized. Dr. Burke has been at Booth UC since the beginning. I even took a few classes from him when I was a student here. He'll help us answer questions about the present, namely, to what extent and in what ways has this institution sought to fulfill Booth's mission. Dr. Jim Reed, PhD, University of California, Los Angeles, and Order of the Founder, is a Christian philosopher specializing in ethics who retired from the faculty of Booth University College in 2020, the year I joined faculty. That same year, he also received the rarest and highest honor that the Salvation Army globally confers on a soldier, the Order of the Founder. He was also my professor for more than a course a few years back, a somewhat lesser honor. He too was at Booth University College in the beginning, to use an Old Testament metaphor. And as living history can speak to the question of how this institution fits into Army mission and perhaps William Booth's vision. Rhonda Friesen, ABD, University of Manitoba, is Dean of Students at Booth University College. She is near the end of her, sorry. Oh. Thank you. Open to all, any and all comments. Okay. She is near the end of her doctoral program in educational administration, and as part of her work, she conducted research on the history of Booth University College and how it fit into the vision and plans of Army leaders as early as William Booth. In my opinion, she has done a unique and valuable service to the institution and the Salvation Army by investigating, collecting, and recounting this history as yet unpublished, and will help us to understand the past better. See, thematic. I'm going to briefly introduce the topic and then pose a question to start us off. And my advice to panelists is to take a page out of the politician's playbook. If you don't like the question you've been asked, then answer the question you would like to have been asked. Booth University College is an expression, and I'm hoping for kind of conversational or kind of formal, but Booth University College is an expression of Salvation Army ministry that began in 1982. But the idea of a Salvation Army University goes back much further. Founder William Booth even spoke of a university for the Salvation Army. In 1890, William Booth published a manifesto regarding a grand scheme to cure humanity's social ills titled In Darkest England and the Way Out. It contained the seed of a plan to collect and disseminate knowledge on global humanitarian endeavor so that the Salvation Army could advance worldwide efforts to alleviate poverty and empower the disenfranchised. At the turn of the 20th century, Booth wanted to solve the problem of a lack of cooperation and of centralized knowledge about the effectiveness of humanitarian efforts. World governments and private organizations had failed to leverage information on demographics and best practices. He proposed that the Salvation Army create an intelligence department for the collection and dissemination of practical knowledge about how to solve the world's problems. In Darkest England refers to it as, quote, a kind of university in which the accumulated experiences of the human race will be masked, digested, and rendered available to the humblest toiler in the great work of social reform. William Booth articulated his vision more fully in 1903 when he published his proposal for a world university for the cultivation of the science of humanity in connection with the Salvation Army. Within the proposal, he also identified another problem he wished to solve: lack of access to worthwhile education amongst the poor. To him, a world university of humanity might have basically meant a centralized global training institution for evangelistic and humanitarian knowledge and practice in the Salvation Army. He envisioned training Salvation Army personnel all over the world, both clergy and laity, for all facets of service. Booth's successors modified his initial vision due to historical circumstances. Salvation Army leaders invoked Booth's vision of a university of humanity with respect to projects that had different parameters than he envisioned. For instance, after World War I, the founder's son, General Bramwell Booth, implemented modest portions of his father's grand vision. Rather than an integrated global network of learning institutions, Bramwell Booth developed regional colleges in London, New York, Chicago, and elsewhere, only for training Salvation Army clergy. Leaders explicitly regarded these colleges as fulfilling the founder's vision. Enter Booth University College. Although Booth's World University of Humanity envisioned a network of training institutions for Salvation Army workers, both clergy and laity, Booth University College opened its enrollment to non-Salvationists from its beginning in 1982. Such examples raise the question, to what extent are these more recent expressions consistent with the founder's vision? Salvation Army leaders have sometimes seen their endeavors within the scope of William Booth's vision of a University of Humanity, but critical questions remain. In what ways and to what extent do these expressions fulfill the founder's vision? How do circumstances such as war, globalization, decolonization, pluralism, and technology facilitate or challenge its viability? And specifically, how does Booth University College fit into the vision? Now, with that question, I hand it over to our panelists to hash this out. how does Booth fit into the,
Well, if I started off, one of the things I'd say is the explicit connection with whatever it is William Booth was advancing and Bramwell Booth after him. That did not register for me, at any rate, in the founding of this institution. Not that I think it's sort of they're worlds apart. It's just, it's nothing I knew of in being recruited to be part of the originating faculty. And it's nothing that I knew of for, I don't know, a couple of years until, a few years after that, I saw, I think it's the thing from Bramwell Booth. It's in preparing for this, I really saw some of that stuff from William Booth. So if other people had that as a sort of blueprint, they didn't communicate that to me. And in some ways, I think it's kind of an odd thing if you're starting a faculty with those objectives in mind, that you'd look for someone who's a PhD in philosophy. Like, that seems odd. Yeah, I know, what good are they? That's what we think is great. You know, they're useless, right? So anyway, well, I say that, but it is for me as a salvationist. It's no wonder that when I entered into the study of philosophy, first of all, it begins with the idea that all truth is God's truth, and we need to worship God with our minds. And so let's develop our minds, and I think that's a responsibility of any part of the church. But within philosophy, that I should specialize in ethics seems to me to give expression to the kind of thing that sort of enlivens the Salvation Army. And so Don will remember an early chapel, one of the earliest chapels for the college. I don't know how we got there, but I was speaking, and in the course of it, I referred to what it, now Dr. Eason will know better than I whether this is apocryphal or not. But at the time I thought it was William Booth actually gave this kind of poem speech some of you would be familiar with, that begins like, while women weep as they do now, I'll fight. And I gave that, and that is a thing that still deeply inspires me. And I think I didn't get through to the end. I started to weep. Now, this is embarrassing for a new faculty member and so on, but in some ways, I mean, very indirect, but that seems to me to give expression to what you don't have to work from a document. Why are you doing this anyway? It's a sense that there are deep things wrong with the world, and we are gifted with minds to do something about it. So then do something about it. And kind of got me here, I suppose. Others should.
I'll jump in. Sorry, Theo. I know we're all out of order here, but thank you. Yeah, so I speak as someone who's relatively new to the Salvation Army. I'm not a member of the Army, and I haven't grown up in the tradition, but I came here as an employee. And I think one of the things that drew me to Booth was kind of the essence of the founder's vision, if you will. Even if it wasn't intentional, I think that it plays out in the very fabric of the start of this institution. In Booth's very expansive vision to include or to bring into the educated realms Salvationists and non-Salvationists alike, the privileged and the underprivileged, and it's something for me as a student of higher education strikes at me deeply, because I think that education is the equalizing force among us in many ways. So the very fact that a school was started on these principles, I find extremely compelling. And the fact that the community was so engaged with Booth at the time. I mean, Pearl McGonigal was the first chair of the Board of Reference for Booth. Board of Reference being a community board that gave guidance and worked alongside the Board of Trustees. It has since been disbanded. But the community of Winnipeg was engaged and invested in the initial foundation of Booth University College. And I think that speaks volumes to the reputation of the Army in the city and in this country. And then finally, the very the commitment to practical application, notwithstanding our philosophy students, but I think they have something to contribute to the world as well, that every single program at Booth from the outset had this practical application of learning in the community. Those were the things that I think, to me, resonates in terms of the echoes of the founder's vision and the startup of Booth.
Maybe if I add to that, Rhonda, I think that the Salvation Army internationally, different from various other parts of and expressions of the church, in that, well, to use some of the language we get in some of the organizational ethics, asking the question, who is the moral owner of whatever? And the Salvation Army, I think, has always existed in this interesting relationship with something beyond those who are, if you want, core members. That we were recruiting a faculty member early on in the days of the college. And this candidate, at least one of the candidates, asked at the end of the interview whether this really was a position that was only for people who were Salvation Army. This individual was not. I was surprised by the question. Now, I understood from this person's history, there had been other cases in which they'd interviewed and learned in the process. This is really reserved for, and fill in the blank, whoever the denomination is. For me, it's not only that the answer was, no, it's not restricted to people who are Salvationists for faculty, but like, that's a surprising question to me. I wouldn't have thought that we would make something like, it's not just the Salvationists wearing the uniform and whatever who own the Salvation. Right? It's this. I think that in the original piece, William Booth had a view like, well, you may not be a Salvationist now, but you will be, like everybody eventually will be. But from the outset, I think that was the idea. No, this needs to engage everybody who could possibly contribute. So. Yeah, I think, should still do that.
I think one of the things that, thinking about the establishment of this institution.
Use your mic.
Oh, yeah, sure. I can do that. One of the features of the aspects of the founding of this institution, yes, there was this sense of vision, and I think I agree with Jim that we didn't hear anything about the University of Humanities for a good part of the way through Earl Robinson's tenure as first president. And then he pulled out William Booth. I would think 6-7 years well into it. So that there was this sense, I think, in the Salvation Army in Canada, amongst certain leaders, that it was time for the Salvation Army to have an institution, initially a Bible college, that it was time for the Salvation Army to have an institution such as this, that the organization, the Salvation Army, had matured to a place where this was appropriate and it could be established and sustained. But there was something much more mundane, more practical involved in the establishment of this institution as well, and that is that there'd been a steady stream of Salvationist young people who had gone to institutions, Bible colleges and other institutions from other traditions, and had ended up migrating to those other traditions. And so there was a real sense that the Salvation Army was losing a number of its young people to other Christian traditions. And that was felt to be an urgent concern. So that there was kind of this visionary, there were different aspects to the motivation to establish this institution. And I think we need to take note of multiple motivations in that process, that decision.
One of the things that has, again, kind of struck me that I marvel at is how quickly this school grew at the outset, you know, from 20 odd students to close to 80 in the first 4 years. And then garnered the recognition and respect of other higher education institutions in Winnipeg. You know, we became a approved teaching center, what, in 96 or something for the University of Manitoba. We had ABC accreditation, of course. And so we were counted as a player in the higher education field within Winnipeg quite quickly, much more so than I think the historical progression of other denominational schools that I could observe. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about kind of Booth's various decisions and progressions till now, because I know that you two have been a part of those.
I think a lot of that initially was the result of first President Earl Robinson's willingness and ability to build connections in the community. Very early on, he made connections with local politicians, leaders in the community, and also in the academic community. Very quickly, he made connections with, for example, the religion department at the University of Manitoba, and particularly, especially Dr. Gordon Harland, who was teaching there and had been instrumental in setting up the approved teaching center relationship between U of M and what was then Canadian Mennonite Bible College. And that's how they forged that model back in 1968. They forged that model of relationship between U of M and smaller institutions in the city, so that Earl had this ability and drive to make those kinds of connections, which I think benefited the institution, especially in its early days, and laid the groundwork for a number of those developments that have been really very helpful. And I think the other thing I would say is that Winnipeg, the academic community in Winnipeg was for the most part very collegial and very helpful from the very beginning. So very early on, I think in the first year, for the first several years of the existence of the college, one of the roles I filled was, where's Megan, Director of Library Services. Knew nothing about what to do with that except buy books. But very early on, University of Winnipeg's library was very generous with us in giving our students borrowing privileges at UW's library. And we had a number of gatherings together with them. So I think the environment in Winnipeg was also very conducive to making those kinds of connections and establishing them very quickly.
I wonder about this. There are multiple sides to the Booth's original vision. One of them making the world a better place. Generally speaking, I wonder if you could speak to the intention to make education accessible, almost like soup is a good, soap is a good. In a manner of speaking, education is a good that not everyone has access to. I wonder how much of that was a part of past, present, or future of Booth University College.
One of the things that, one of the stories about the development of the institution that I think says something about the ethos of Booth is that in 2010, the summer of 2010, June of 2010, the provincial legislature passed legislation renaming Booth from William and Catherine, Salvation Army William and Catherine Booth College to Booth University College, has a longer official name, but Booth University College. And when they did that, I can remember we had conversations about, was there some way we could articulate the vision for the institution? And at that time, the three public universities in Manitoba had marketing campaigns that were all focused on you. So University of Manitoba was U of More, being the largest of the three. University of Winnipeg's was advertising itself as UYOU of W. And Brandon University was advertising itself as BU, YOU again. So all three institutions of the public institutions were thinking in terms of, at least as I interpret it, education is all about yourself. And so we began thinking about, is there a way to articulate the mission of this institution in a manner that clearly differentiates us, but also expresses more of the ethos of what we think education is about. And that's really where the statement "Education for a Better World" came, was in the summer of 2010, and the reflection on the contrast between the mission of this institution as we wanted to articulate it and what was in the marketing of the three larger institutions in the province. And so Education for a Better World had this possibility, I think, for us as an institution to stake out and articulate very, very much. Our mission wasn't just to do more. It wasn't to focus only on students, and we didn't want students to simply see education as self-centered, but rather that it's really about looking outward beyond ourselves. And ultimately, that's the kind of education that this institution is about. And that's the kind of impact we want our students to have when they go out from this place.
I think on, and that was after my days.
Yes.
You were long. I was long. They hived off from, well, we hived off the Ethics Center from the college. That's development that we don't go into. But responding, Isaiah, to your question, I think that's an ongoing challenge that certainly in principle, in theory, I think from the very outset, the idea is God's distributed brains all over the place. But money isn't distributed all over the place. And so access, it can be more limited. And I think it's been a challenge to see that the doors actually are open to the people who have the capacity to succeed. And it's certainly more than those who can afford it. And I think an additional challenge in the Salvation Army is the fact that this institution from its outset was, if not unique, pretty rare as a post-secondary educational institution. But around the world, well, I just was doing some writing recently and was reminded there are over 600,000 students in Salvation Army schools around the world. It's like twice the size of Toronto School Board population in Salvation Army schools in various places in the world. Most of them dirt poor. These schools are set up in many places where the opportunity for a public school is just not there. And so I think there were some leaders of the Salvation Army early on who said we could set up some scholarships perhaps for students to come and be subsidized and come here for it. Now, I think that there are thousands more that could benefit, but I don't know, there are different initiatives over the years that have been undertaken to see that there can be online kind of access. Like I was talking to Tio and saying back there, we were responsible for bringing in the first computers. We had little PCs in the mid 1980s, you know, they had maximum capacity of like 30 megs hard drive, right? I mean,
Kilobytes.
yeah. So there's 6 foot anyway. Yeah. The point is the notion of online access, it was not there. But again, early on, there was somebody, a senior leader of the Salvation Army, maybe part of the board at the time, who was pushing for correspondence courses. And the second president had his roots in international education and knew the value of court. So, I mean, this is a long way of saying, I think that it needs to, the institution should grab onto it and see how we can actually actualize this vision that that people would have have access to the quality education wherever they live and whatever their needs.
I know this is exactly where Aaron should jump in, but I'm gonna insert myself. So just to say that social justice is what galvanizes us, you know, that vision, Don, that you guys worked out, the education for a better world. We don't have a sports team here, et cetera. What brings us together is the cause of social justice. And you're absolutely right, Isaiah, education is a good. It is something that improves not only our personal lives, but the lives of those that we interact with and in our community. And that is the challenge for this future, whether it's within the Army or the Army within the world through the mechanism of education. We're making that difference. And that's the challenge as to how do we do that in terms of social justice. Hand it on to Aaron.
I suppose I've been sitting too quiet here for too long. So I'm not a salvationist. I don't have that deep an understanding of this history. In fact, in reviewing some of the documents Isaiah circulated before us getting together here today, I came to appreciate through reading those documents just exactly what Booth's vision was for this university for the humanity. And there were, some surprising things there. We were talking about it at lunch yesterday, from the budget for $5 million for the construction of 2 universities in the 1920s. And although $3 million of that was for an endowment, and the university structures themselves, he felt could be constructed with 500,000 each, both in London and New York. Never mind the colonial language around some of the things, although he was quite progressive in the non-discriminatory sort of approach, allowing for people of all stripes, colors, sexual backgrounds, and so on, which was wonderful to read. And I think we do still reflect some of those things here. I came across some of that vision, I guess, when I was doing my dissertation research a few years ago on the history of Black gospel music. And there's a number of different strands that feed into that, including the church and the church history. And somehow, Booth's expression of worship, with brass bands and things like that, represented a different faction of society in Victorian England that was largely overlooked, the folk sort of working class background. And I think there was an overriding approach to society in those days that was top down and very much entrenched. And I think Booth's vision for education was to provide a means of transforming those conditions, just one person at a time. And I think that represents the social justice that you're talking about.
Can I ask you very specifically, how does Shelter U attempt to bring higher education to those that don't normally have access to it?
And that's one of the things that I was struck by in reading about this history, was there was this vision, for the underprivileged. In reading the 1923 memorandum, this vision for these universities, it's very much meant to serve officers in training to go into working for the Salvation Army. And there's only clauses there for non-Salvationists or lay persons. And I think that's where Shelter U offers an alternative, where I think it fits some of his other vision for those, non-officers. If you look at it sociologically, there's 2 classes that he envisions for the world, one being Salvationist class. Maybe, okay, 3. There's the non-churched wretched class, he calls it. And then there's the Salvationists who serve them. But then there's also the elite whom he's appealing to for the money to support this project. And so if you think of it in that way, there's only 3 outcomes for this University for Humanity. It's to stay a part of the wretched class. It's to join the Salvationists in their social work, or it's to, be fruitful, producing members of society. And in that sense, I think Shelter U is going to, maybe serve the wretched class in a sense, and get out there and provide opportunities that we're maybe not fulfilling in its full potential here at Booth quite yet. And, possibly invite them in to join us. I got to be careful with how I say that too, because it's not that we're serving the wretched class or we're inviting them in. I think it's also, there's a clause in that memorandum where he says, where he's justifying his vision for this thing early on in the memorandum. He says, one of the reasons for this is the fact that there are other people out there who recognize the value of this thing, the value of this project. People like myself and Rhonda, perhaps, who aren't necessarily Salvationists, but who completely identify with the justice of it all. So I could get more specific into what Shelter U is in a moment, but I feel like I've been rambling for a bit, so maybe
and maybe I'll invite you to actually go in specific, but we'll have a minute or 2 for anyone who wishes to pose a question, from the audience, and so you can think about that. But yeah, please tell us, what is Shelter U and the vision behind that?
Sure, thanks. Shelter U is it draws on the ideas of Earl Shorus, who was a sociologist interviewing prisoners. One being Venice Walker, a woman in a women's correctional facility in New York in the 1990s, who was asked, how do you address poverty? She says, you got to teach them the arts. She's very forthright with Shorus. He was kind of like, he didn't really get it. She's like, no, you got it. And so after thinking about it and humbling himself to recognize what exactly she was talking about, he came to realize there's a whole vision for who we are as people that the university can and sometimes even achieves in communicating to us as students, but is often precluded from the impoverished. And so she saw this as an opportunity or a way for people to come to appreciate themselves and their place in society. Shorus took a big books humanities approach to say, well, then let's offer humanities to the impoverished. And certainly there have been programs like his that have sprung up, teaching university to people in prisons, university for veterans returning from conflicts, war zones, things like this. And then in general, just for impoverished people. And it's been found to be hugely transformative. Gives people time and space in which they can explore what it means to be a member of modern society, things like that. We think that by going, leaving the comfort of our own spaces and going out into the shelter, getting closer to the impoverished, we can encourage that sort of process. And that's what we're aiming to do with the pilot already this fall. We've been in talks organizing, recruiting instructors who have the same sort of vision. And we'll be offering 2 courses as a minimum, hopefully expanding beyond that. But using some, not only humanities, but like participatory forms of learning, like with music and things like that.
Yeah, and it strikes me as something that is a departure from a functional education, strictly functional education, or the workhouses, or necessarily learning a trade, but saying the arts is something and the humanities is something that itself is uplifting and kind of fully human.
It's true. It's an important point to stress, that this is not necessarily practical in the sense that we're transforming people into, working at, minions in a sense,
Maybe there's a place for a philosophy course.
Yeah,
Can't get more useless than that.
we're recruiting instructors. Like
We
join.
So we do have a couple of minutes, if there's anyone, from the audience here or even online who wishes to raise a question or maybe even make a comment or an addition, a subtraction, multiplication. Please, Amy.
So thank you to each one of you for, I did my undergraduate work here, and I have a great bond in first place. One of the things that really struck me when I entered was this idea of education for a better world, even though we didn't have that title. And the idea that as a Salvationist, I could do big things in the world just by doing things that seem not very useful. I was grateful also to have a community of students that were some were Salvationists, some identified as Christians from another organization that identified as a denomination, and faculty some identified as Salvationists, others do not. And it was a very rich environment, and it's still like I would not need it. My question though has to do with the attraction that politics has over time to Salvationists in particular. It's wonderful that the idea of social justice that spreads beyond just Salvation Army. It doesn't seem to have attracted already Salvationists. We see Salvation going to still other religious or denominational or Christian politics. And we also see them going to secular universities. So I wonder why we have not had greater.
I do too, but
Do you have any thoughts?
one of the things my wife says, this is maybe a bit of an angle, Amy, but as I look at you and Emily and others who are graduates of this institution, Lori, my wife says, why are they not telling the stories of the graduates, where they are, what they've done with their lives? So Rhonda you've done a paper that I read, and included in it was a page from a war cry of 1992 rather. So 10 years into the college, it had 3 women profiled. Diana Macquarie, who is now Diana Bussey, who is a recognized expert nationally, has appeared nationally in terms of trafficking of persons. A second was Marion Cooper, who is here in Winnipeg and is the executive director of Canadian Mental Health Association, Manitoba. And the third was Sherry Longmire, now Sherry Russell, who is the head of an international learning organization called NAIDS for Indigenous Persons Internationally. So just these three out of that class. Why are we not telling this story, right? It seems to me hugely attractive if people know those are the people who got their undergraduate education in this place from these people. Could hardly do better than get Dr. Burke for an Old Testament. I'm like, first time in 40 years, I'm a student again. Yeah.
I can say a few things about that. About you as a student.
Well, our time, and I had a professor in my graduate studies who used to end every class with, well, more could be said. And indeed more could be said, but as we move on into our lunchtime, and remember it's complimentary, I'd like to close us in a word of prayer, if I invite you to join me. As we gather at the table of fellowship, may we know your precious presence. In the breaking of bread, as your disciples have long experienced you. And may you generously pour out your Holy Spirit upon this community. In Christ's name, amen. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Don't forget next week, President Robert Springer will be speaking at chapel.
Same time, same place.
Bless you all. Thank you. Yes, thank our panelists.